All right, so welcome again, everyone, to the Criminal Law as a Tool of Authoritarian Control speaker series put on by the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management at the Harvard Kennedy School. For those of you who have joined us in the past for our event series, welcome back. You may notice that things are slightly different this time around. Rather than a full open meeting, we're running this semester as a webinar. One, in part because we have a lot of subscription and interest in this series, which we're so thrilled about. So thank you to all of you who are here in the space. That said, we do like to encourage engagement, share resources, have reactions, and of course have questions. As they come to your mind, feel free to put them in the chat. The chat is available and open, and we would really encourage engagement there. But please know that you are being recorded if you do choose to speak and ask your own question at some point when we get to the Q&A portion of the event. And also this recording will then be put online on our website and our YouTube channel, and I will drop links to those in the chat momentarily. For other events in this speaker series, you can find them on our website at the link I just put in the chat. And if you'd like to see past events of our program, you're welcome to find them on our YouTube channel. The next event is 2 weeks from today, Policing Borders and the Designation of Enemies Within, with Daniel Gascon and Naomi Roth-Ariaza. And to start us off for the series, we're so delighted to have Yanilda González, who is going to talk to us today about the popularity of punishment. I'm going to give a brief bio of Yanilda, but you can find more about Yanilda on our website and on the Kennedy School's website. And then the structure for today is going to start with a brief presentation, probably about 25 to 30 minutes from Yanilda, and then a few questions from me, and then finally opening it up to questions from the audience. So again, if you have questions that come to your mind as she's talking, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then I will go back through starting from the top of the queue at the end of the conversation, and we will ask people if they want to unmute and ask their own questions. I see folks raising hands. For the moment, we're not going to take questions because we want to get to the program, but the raised hand function does work in this format, and also the Q&A function does work in this format as well. But if you have a specific question, if you want to drop it in the chat to the panelists, that is totally fine, and we will also be able to answer them through the Q&A function. Okay, so to kick us off, I'll introduce Yanilda, who is an assistant professor of public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship in democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Her book, Authoritarian Police in Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America, studies the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, looking at how ordinary democratic politics in unequal societies can reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of expansive reforms. She received her PhD in politics and social policy from Princeton University, and prior to joining HKS, was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago and has worked at a number of human rights organizations throughout her career. Welcome, Yanilda. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, for inviting me to be a part of the series, which is just has such an impressive list of scholars tackling these questions that are unfortunately so timely about sort of authoritarianism and the use of coercion and how that can coincide quite comfortably with democracy, right, which we think should not be the case. But so that's essentially the set of questions that I'll be presenting for us to think about together today. So it just really is a delight to be able to think through with all of you. So I'll share my screen if you will bear with me for a moment.
Perfect.
So are folks able to see that okay? Okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So this paper is co-authored with Nathan Iskihin from, previously was at Harvard University as a postdoc, now he's at the University of Georgia. And so in this paper, we are examining the effects of what we call repression-based appeals by politicians in democracies and how they actually shape demands for repression. So if we think about the theme for today's seminar of the popularity of punishment, it's about how politicians themselves can generate and foment that popularity of punishment. So let me give you a couple of examples of just what that can look like. Right, so repression, so not only just punishment, right, but repression itself is what we're going to be talking about here today. And that is a phenomenon that is more typically associated with autocracies, right? But in recent years, politicians seem to have been reading a lot of Max Weber, right? Who once said that, quote, "The decisive means of politics is violence," end quote. Because what we've seen in recent years is an increase in politicians in democratic contexts making explicit appeals about leveraging the state's coercive authority to address social problems, specifically by exceeding any legal restrictions in the use of force against some disfavored outgroup. And these examples, which I'm happy to go into deeper in the Q&A, but right from the Philippines to the US to El Salvador to Brazil, which is what we're going to be talking about, this is just a common phenomenon that we've been seeing in many national contexts. And we wanted to sort of delve deeper into that. So because all of those politicians that I just spotlighted in the previous slide decisively won their elections, we really wanted to understand what are the underlying incentives behind these repression-based appeals. So in this paper, we look specifically at whether politicians' statements about police violence shape citizens' attitudes toward police killings and police reforms, as well as the own evaluation of those politicians' competence. And so we addressed this question through a nationwide survey in Brazil, where we experimentally exposed the respondents to varied politician statements defending or criticizing police killings. And we also experimentally manipulated the partisanship of that mayor, of the politician that's speaking. And what we find is that repression-based appeals has clear benefits for certain politicians, and there's important partisan variation that we'll talk about, that we'll get into. Just bring everything up so we can think about it. And so in this paper, as we thought about these research questions, we look at two sets of literatures, and I'll go over this pretty quickly, but the references are there in case anybody's interested. But essentially, these are two sets of literatures that are not often in conversation with each other, despite the fact that they relate very nicely or really well and incisively to the question of the role of repression in politics. So first, there's a literature that shows that there's generally robust public support for militarized and repressive policing, and most of these are done in Latin America. And that's despite the fact that this kind of militarized repressive policing has been shown to have little or even detrimental effects on crime and can lead to an increase in human rights violations. Another line of scholarship provides a sense of where support for repression may come from, especially in the context of protest repression and in militarized police operations. So these studies find that whether victims are framed as innocent or criminal can really shape whether or not people support repression towards these groups, and also who is the messenger about information about these groups and about what the state is doing. So is it security forces or human rights organizations, etc.? We find that this literature finds rather that this can have a huge impact on whether or not people support repression. And so given that there is this high support for repressive policing and that framing and narratives can shape this support, we want to know whether politicians' statements can also be part of what can shape people's attitudes toward repression and the type of police violence that I talked about at the outset. There's a further literature that comes mostly from the cross-national human rights field that argues that actually this type of police violence we'll be talking about, police killings in democracies such as ours that largely target marginalized groups, that this type of police violence is not actually a political process at all. And so these scholars differentiate repressive and oppressive violence, and they argue that repression against people exercising basic political rights is indeed politically motivated. But the types of violence or repression promoted by, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, or Trump in the United States, or Bukele in El Salvador, against mostly marginalized groups, that this is not driven by political motives, but instead this results from the personal biases of the frontline coercive agents. So the officers on the street, those masked ICE agents, they're just acting out of their own biases, for example. But in this paper, we ask whether state violence against marginalized groups of the sort that we just discussed in these democracies, whether this is truly apolitical, or whether there is a way that this is actually political violence as well and driven by political processes. You might, given my work, you might already understand that the answer is yes. So I think, yes, that was the next slide. So what we argue instead is that the politicians indeed have considerable political motivations to politicize the state's coercive institutions. And so first, we argue that repressive policing, because it enjoys broad support in many contexts and voters across the ideological spectrum have actually been increasingly embracing these like more traditional tough on crime policies that we might think about, such as increasing penalties for certain crimes. This is no longer something that signals recent work has shown that this is not something that signals ideology as much anymore, that there is sort of broad left-right support for these types of policies, including in the United States and in Latin America. Second, we suspect that politics plays a role here because scholars have also shown that attitudes towards police and police violence are often polarized along salient social and political cleavages. And they found that it's in the US where race and partisanship can really shape people's perceptions of the police and as well as their attitudes toward police violence. In Brazil, my co-author and I find in a different paper that voting for right-wing former President Jair Bolsonaro or left-wing Lula, as well as the ideology of racial resentment, that these are really strong predictors for whether somebody's going to support police violence. So we think that this is a real opportunity of political strategy for politicians who want to build support based on politicizing the use of force. And so we argue that this incentive structure opens up, again, this potential for repression-based appeals, which we think about as statements that favor the expansion of the state's coercive authority against marginalized groups and presenting them as security threats as a means of solving social problems. When politicians make repression-based appeals, they stand to gain politically in two ways. First, they can improve their perceptions of competence by being seen as taking forceful action on a salient issue. And in particular, in a way that differentiates them in a field where nearly all the politicians are probably going to be making these usual tough on crime, taking these tough on crime stances. And second, through these repression-based appeals, politicians can actually expand what we call the constituency for repression, right? So they actually build support for increased police violence and decrease support for police reforms to try to contain these coercive institutions. And we choose to test our theory about repression-based appeals in Brazil, which is a country that we think constitutes a critical case. It's a context where police are exceedingly violent against their own citizens. So we did this, really quick comparison of the correlation between just one measure of democracy, right? We can use others, but the VDEM electoral democracy index and the rate of police killings per 1 million inhabitants, which is data on police killings is extremely bad everywhere and it's hard to compare. But given that caveat, what we find is that Brazil is really an outlier among democracies in the extent to which it engages in violence against its citizens, right? Only Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago are higher and more outliers, but everybody else is far below what we see in Brazil. We also find that Brazil is also a context with very high support for police killings, where actually, let me tell you, before I tell you about support for police killings, I wanted to just talk about the magnitude of police killings. So you saw that it's an outlier, but just let me give you a sense of the numbers in case that's helpful for you to imagine what the rates look like. So in the United States, where of course police killings have been a key item on the agenda for a decade, in every year, it's about 1,100, 1,200 people in the last few years in terms of the number of victims, the number of people that have been killed by police forces in the United States. In Brazil, one of the most recent years, in 2023, it was 6,000. It was about almost 6,400 victims, right? Despite a much smaller population. And while police killings, as difficult as it is to measure in the United States, the best estimates find that they have increased 15 to 20% in the preceding decade. In Brazil, they have increased almost 200% in the preceding decade. And so it's a really glaring, urgent case for examining this question. And so unsurprisingly, right, Brazil is a context with high support for police killings, and politicians also declare themselves to be in favor of police killings, and this wins them elections. So let me just show you some data from our survey, from that previous paper that I mentioned. where we find that a plurality of Brazilians, so 41%, agree with the statement that, quote, a good criminal is a dead criminal, which is might surprise many of us in the United States, but this is actually a common expression in Brazil. And 41% of people agreed with it. In previous surveys, support was found to be as high as 50% and even 60%. So it's really a much more popular way of thinking than we might originally think. Moreover, this kind of rhetoric is something that is reflected in political discourse. Here are just two examples of campaign appeals made by two victorious candidates, former President Jair Bolsonaro and the former governor of Brazil's largest state, in São Paulo, João Doria. So, you know, Bolsonaro famously said, if someone says I want to give carte blanche for the military police to kill, I respond, yes, I do. Right. So he was definitely not being subtle at all in his support for police violence. Similarly, for the governor, you know, he said the police will shoot when I take office, essentially, the police will shoot and they will shoot to kill. And finally, police killings in Brazil, as they do so many other places, right, they reflect stark social inequality and salient political divisions. So in Brazil, police, as in the United States, right, police killings are highly racialized. 82%, 83% of victims of police killings in Brazil were Black, in compared to about 56% of the population that is Black. And accordingly, this racialized nature of police violence is central in many social movement campaigns, including the one that I included here on the screen, where they really bring the attention to the role of race in police violence. And we also want to highlight that that we and other scholars have shown that police violence in Brazil also really aligns with partisan and ideological cleavages. So in this survey, we found that while gender and race are not strong predictors of support for police violence, we do find that partisanship and ideology really matter. So supporters of former right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro and those with high racial resentment were far more likely to agree that killing, killing people who are criminals, that a good criminal is a dead criminal, to agree with this phrase. So there's a clear political dimension to people's support for police violence. And so in this context, Brazil is a crucial place to study politicians' incentives to engage in repression-based appeals. And so to do so, we conducted a two-wave nationwide survey experiment, survey with a pre-registered survey experiment. And the data for this paper come from the second wave of that survey, which had more than 6,000 participants. And so here's just some information about that survey. And this is kind of what the experimental manipulation looked like. It consisted of a fictitious news article, but this looks very similar to real news reports about police killings in Brazil. And it reports about a highly lethal police operation in the state of Rio de Janeiro, where 19 people were killed. And the article includes a statement about the killings from the mayor of the city where it took place. And that represented the one of the experimental manipulations. So we varied the type of statement that the politician made, a control group where he just said, this is being investigated. And then 4 other sets of messages where he either defends or criticizes police killings or where he criminalizes or humanizes victims. And we also varied the partisanship, because partisanship is so important to people's support for police violence. We wanted to vary the politician's partisanship. And so we had either a mayor that was not aligned with any party, one that was aligned with the leftist current president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or the former right-wing president Jair Bolsonaro. And these allow us to see the effects of the statements themselves as well as the politician's partisanship. And so the outcomes, just very quickly, we look at different measures of how do people evaluate the politician's competence, and then their support for police killings, which we measure in various ways, but I'll probably just show you one of them for the sake of time, and then support for police reform, and I probably will also show you just one of them for the sake of time. But we really wanted to see this in a kind of a multidimensional way to understand what does the support for police violence look like, and in which ways can it be affected by these politicians' statements. So this just summarizes one of our main hypotheses, So essentially, our hypotheses are that politicians' statements defending police violence are likely to increase perceptions of competence and support for police violence, as well as decreasing support for police reform. Whereas statements criticizing police violence by these politicians should have the opposite effect. And we also hypothesize that statements about victims, either criminalizing or humanizing them, is also going to affect empathy, people's empathy towards victims. And we expect that these effects will be heightened by voters' partisanship, as well as whether the voter and the mayor being cited is are co-partisans or not. So in order to examine one of our key assumptions, we wanted to first look descriptively at the relationship between political polarization and support for police violence. This shows the sort of descriptive results of a feeling thermometer, where we ask sort of how much do you like or dislike people on a scale of 1 to 100, the people being mentioned. And what we find is that Brazil is indeed highly polarized. People really like their own guy, and the guy's supporters, but they really dislike the other guy and the other guy's supporters. And you can see it's like fairly symmetrical on the left and the right, how they feel about the main political figure and their supporters. So we then examined how these polarized partisan identities affect attitudes towards state coercion. And across all measures, we see that right-wing Bolsonaro voters are far more likely to support police violence. And they express higher agreement with that torture is justified, that police killings increase security, and that levels of police violence, that the level of police violence, which I'll remind you is at a rate of 6,400, rate 6,400 or so in recent years, that level of police killings is just right or not high enough. And so notably, the partisan gap is the lowest, and overall support is the lowest when participants are presenting. So I want you to look at the bottom right panel, which looks at this specific support for police violence, where we presented people with a really concrete hypothetical case of a police killing that signals real wrongdoing by the police. And this is where we see the lowest, not only the lowest support, but the lowest support among supporters of right-wing Bolsonaro, and the lowest partisan gap between the two. And so this suggests to us that information can shift people's attitudes toward police violence, with the largest reductions happening, as I said, among right-wing voters themselves. So we think that there's a really important insight here that we want to look at more experimentally. So to turn to our experimental findings, I'm going to show you a lot of graphs that unfortunately all look the same, but I'll try to sort of flag what are the key takeaways. So the first result that we want to share with you is sort of the evaluations of politicians' competence. And so these findings reveal that politicians' incentives to make repression-based appeals are really shaped by partisan expectations. Voters overall appear to hold very clear assumptions about how left and right-wing politicians are expected to respond to police violence, right? They expect that right-wing politicians are expected to defend police violence, and that left-wing leaders will criticize it. And when politicians adhere to these expectations, we find no significant effects on voters' perceptions of politicians' competence. But when they deviate from these expectations, we see real interesting results, which I'll just get into right now. So if you look at panel A, voters do not appear to react when right-wing mayors defend police killings. Maybe they just say, well, that's to be expected. And so we don't see any change on whether or not you see this person as competent in addressing security. But when politicians defy these partisan expectations, we see, again, decisive results from voters. When leftist mayors defend police killings, so that's that center, these are the Lula allies that we want to look at. When these Lula allies, these leftist mayors defend police killings, they are seen as more competent by voters overall, which is that little the little black one, the little black coefficient, the little black dot. They are seen as more competent by voters overall. And we find this finding is mostly driven by Bolsonaro voters. Their boost in even though these are left-wing mayors, their boost in being seen as more confident comes from right-wing voters. Being more seen as more competent, rather, is coming from right-wing voters. And we see a similar pattern in panel B, which shows for respondents that saw the message critiquing police killings. So when the politicians adhere to partisan expectations, for example, the left mayor, so the Lula ally, when he is criticizing police killings, we don't see any effect, any significant effects on people's perceived competence of this mayor. But when the right-wing mayor, Bolsonaro allies criticize police killings, we see this real divergence, right? So that mayor is going to see a competence boost, right? The left-wing voters are going to see that mayor as more competent. But that mayor also is going to face a reduction in, it's going to be seen as less competent by right-wing voters. So it creates this, you know, you win some support among some voters, but you're going to lose among your own base if you are a right-wing politician who criticizes police killings. So kind of a key takeaway for us here is that defending police killings carries no political penalty. There's no penalty. They are not seen as less competent by defending police violence. And indeed, some politicians, especially those on the left, are going to be rewarded by defending police killings by being seen as more competent. We now wanted to look at what we call, but people's evaluation of the specific killings described in the vignette. And just to remind you, this is a police operation that resulted in the death of 19 people. And so this is people's evaluation of that really horrific, deadly operation. So we examined the treatment effects of first the statement where politicians defend police killings. And we find that statements defending police violence increase support for police killings among Lula and Bolsonaro supporters when no information is presented about the mayor's partisanship. However, we find that the effects of these statements are amplified when a co-partisan, so a right-wing mayor when a right-wing voter is listening to a right-wing mayor and a left-wing voter is listening to a left-wing mayor, we see that those effects are strongest. So a left voter listening to a left mayor, look at that Lula ally column in the middle, that even though they are overall less likely to support police killings, they are become more likely to support police killings when they hear somebody on their own side supporting police killings. And if we look at panel B, which is again statements being critical of this very lethal operation, it displays the effects on these voters of these critical statements. What we find is that when the mayor's partisanship is not revealed, the politician's statements criticizing police killings reduce support for police violence among everybody. Well, the independence one is not significant, but both on the left and the right, that mayor's statement criticizing police killings reduces positive evaluations of that operation among voters on both sides. But we see that there's a partisan effect here too, where perhaps because, again, leftist politicians are expected to criticize police killings, we don't see very much specific partisan effects in that center Lula column, other than on voters overall. But we see something really interesting in the far right column among Bolsonaro. So when right-wing mayors criticize police killings, we see that it reduces support for police killings among all voters, and the largest effects are among right-wing voters. So when right-wing politicians, hypothetically, if they were to speak out against police violence, they could especially reduce support for police violence among their co-partisans, who, as we said, are already more likely to support police killings. And so overall, this suggests that respondents are really responsive to what they hear from their political leaders. When they hear people defending police killings, just about everybody is more likely to be supportive of it. And when they hear people criticizing it, they are less likely to be supportive of it. And so if we consider these findings jointly with what I just showed you about competence, perceptions of politicians' competence, it introduces a really important paradox that really illuminates the challenge of reducing police violence. So it may be politically feasible to reduce support for state violence through elite rhetoric, right? These politicians' discourses. And that's even holds for right-wing politicians, or perhaps it especially holds for right-wing politicians and voters. But these politicians have few incentives to criticize police violence, since they are going to be seen as less competent among some voters on a really salient policy issue. So we can talk more about that competence, that paradox in the Q&A. I'm not going to show you empathy just for the sake of time, but you know, it's not great. I wanted to just share with you one of the reform outcomes. So we looked at whether politicians' statements defending or criticizing police killings would shape people's support for police reforms. We don't find super strong findings on other types of reforms, but the one on body cameras is interesting because this is one of the most common like go-to reforms that we're seeing lately. So the only significant effect that we find here is that when leftist politicians defend police violence, it reduces support for body cameras among left-wing voters. So when these leftist politicians defend police violence, as we saw before, it increases support for police violence among leftist voters, and it also reduces support for police reforms. Body cameras probably have like nearly universal support in Brazil and probably in the United States as well. But it's extremely high. But it reduces support among a constituency that is generally supportive of it when their own co-partisan mayors defend police violence. We also looked at police demilitarization, which is another type of reform that's often talked about. We asked about limiting access to military equipment in particular, but there's many ways to define militarization. And we find mostly null effects again here too, with one interesting exception. Exposing people, I'm going to point your attention to panel B. Exposing people to discourses that criticize police violence significantly increases agreement that demilitarization, that there ought to be demilitarization when the statement comes from an outpartisan mayor. So when the right-wing mayor criticizes police killings, it increases support for demilitarization among voters overall, and especially among left-wing voters. And when the Lula ally criticizes police killings, it also increases support for demilitarization, but only among right-wing voters. And so it's interesting to sort of see how do people turn to or think about police reforms in the context of either these statements defending or criticizing police killings. And then just a final result that I'm going to show you, we included, let me just lock the door because I hear my daughter outside. We'll delete that from the video, right?
Sure thing, no problem.
And I took, but anyway, so we wanted to more closely approximate behavior. So how might these attitudes translate into real world behavior? So we included a question asking people after they were exposed to these treatments, whether they would like to share one of two images. So one of them, I thought I had the slide. I can show it later if folks want to see it, it's later on. But one image bears the phrase, "I support the military police," and the other shows the phrase, "End police violence." So we wanted to see if hearing these statements from politicians would prompt people to download one of these two images and share it with their friends on WhatsApp. So we don't know if they actually shared it on their friends with WhatsApp, but about almost 1,000 people did download one of the two. And it was fairly similar. 505 people selected the pro-police sticker and 475 chose the anti-police violence sticker. And what we find again is mostly null effects for the anti-police violence sticker. So what we're showing you here is the pro-police sticker, the one that says, "I support the military police." And so panel A shows null effects of statements defending police violence on downloading the pro-police sticker. But what we see in panel B is that statements that are critical of police killings produce some interesting asymmetries. So Lula voters were less likely to download the pro-police sticker after they heard a mayor criticizing police killings. And Bolsonaro voters had kind of a backlash effect. And so they were more likely to download the pro-police sticker when they heard a Bolsonaro, a right-wing mayor criticizing police violence. And so this suggests that with the competence measure, defiance of partisan expectations by right-wing politicians can produce a backlash effect among a large group of voters, particularly those on the right. And we also find, as you can see on the far right column, it also produces an effect on independent voters. So just to kind of wrap up, our findings, I think, have important implications for understanding the politics of state violence. So essentially, despite the fact that political science has paid relatively little attention to state violence in democracies, we show that there are real political underlying factors, political drivers rather, of state violence. That there are clear political motivations to employ repression-based appeals among against marginalized groups depicted as security threats. And specifically, we show that politicians, especially those on the left, can actually gain politically. They see a confidence boost when they defend police violence, particularly from voters on the other side of the ideological divide. And we also find that criticizing police killings can have an asymmetric effect. So it increases perceptions of competence among left-wing voters, but it decreases perceptions of competence among right-wing voters. And we find that politicians can also benefit from repression-based appeals by increasing the constituency, right? So the number of people that support police violence and oppose police reforms. And so perhaps for this reason, right, is why we see this the prominence of repression-based appeals more recently in the United States. But an important practical implication of our findings is that criticizing repression can entail political costs. So even for left-wing politicians whose constituents are more likely to be subjected to state violence, police violence, etc., they actually may lack incentives to criticize this violence because it can lead a large segment of the voters to view them as less competent. So let me just give you a couple of examples. This can help explain some important puzzles, such as why we often hear silence from left-wing politicians and parties when we see an escalation of repression. So in Brazil in recent years, many observers, as you see from the articles here, many observers questioned why leftist President Lula and his administration were largely silent amid rapid spikes in police killings in multiple states. And in the United States, we've seen many people questioning why leaders of the Democratic Party have, with few exceptions, right, largely declined to prioritize opposition to anti-immigration repression, which has included really clear extra legal practices such as arbitrary detentions of authorized immigrants for political speech, the employment of wartime powers to send hundreds of migrants to the Secot prison in El Salvador for indefinite imprisonment. Right, we saw really muted responses to this from the Democratic Party, and I think our study can shed some light on why. And so taken together, our results show that repression-based appeals should be part of conversations about democratic backsliding that we hear so much about in sort of both popular media and in scholarship. Democratic erosion does not only occur through attacks on judicial independence or constraining freedom of the press, it also occurs through strategic weakening of constraints on the use of force. And I think we ought to think more about why that is, what that looks like, and politicians' role in driving that. So I'll stop there, and many thanks for thinking through all of this with us. So I'll stop sharing my screen, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
And it may be that we'll go back to certain slides as we talk, or
Sure.
if other people have questions later. But so thank you for that rich discussion of this paper. And a reminder for folks in the audience that this paper is not yet published, right? So they can't go find this paper somewhere. So this is a preview.
Not yet,
but at some point
soon.
it's coming. But we can is it okay if we put the abstract on our website along with the video when the time comes? Yeah, so that folks can return to these themes. And I think it might be helpful because that was so detailed in the kind of specific findings. To the question in the chat, yes, the webinar will be uploaded to YouTube. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and I'll drop that link again momentarily. But I think, your work across many years at this point has kind of looked at this way that politics shapes perception, and then perception shapes politics also, right, in this kind of negative feedback loop. And this paper has a lot of relevance to that, and you talk to us about competence and kind of this paradox, right, the kind of counterintuitive ways in which certain partisans actually prefer their opponents to do things that are more in line with their views, and then that builds legitimacy in a certain way, right? So I'm wondering if we could zoom out a little bit and talk more about that relationship between sort of political rhetoric, punitive policy, and then popular opinion, and how that limits the horizon for reform or for counter-mobilization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is really interesting about this is that people's life experiences, people's identities, people's voting history or partisan preferences, that these are and appear to be really entrenched views and things that are hard to change. But one of the things that I think that our study finds, this paper, the other paper that I referenced that will hopefully come out soon in the American Journal of Political Science, and sort of my broader work about how scandals can help drive police reforms. It also shows that these things can shift, are really dynamic, and they can shift really quickly. That giving people different types of information, having them hearing from different types of actors, in some cases from unexpected sources. So like hearing a right-wing politician critiquing police violence or repression or repressive action in different ways, can actually help change the nature of these otherwise entrenched beliefs that people hold, right? So more recently, when we saw right-wing conservative American leaders coming out against what they saw as censorship by the administration, right? And so this likely was very decisive. Hearing from unlikely sources, speaking out against their own party, I think helped shape outcomes that we saw in this, and building opposition to that censorship. And so I think similarly, when it comes to police killings, in my book in particular, I talk about this kind of convergence that can be produced by certain scandalous cases that can change attitudes. So it's both these kind of political dynamics can make police reform really difficult and make police violence really hard to tackle. But the dynamic nature of them, if people can leverage some of these strategies of messaging and framing and using certain messengers, it can help lead to pretty dynamic, pretty transformative, or at least movements, if not always. The reforms themselves are often a lot less than what they're cracked out to be, but fairly large mass-based transformative movements to try to change these conditions. And so there's some light there in that dark tunnel of police violence.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do have like 4 or 5 questions already coming in, which is terrific. So again, people, if you have questions that are coming to your mind, by all means, throw them in the Q&A or throw them in the chat. I'm going to ask maybe 1 or 2 more, and then we'll pivot to audience questions. I think one of the things that came up in your talk, and that we also got an audience Q&A about, that I'm going to slightly adjust in keeping with one of my own questions, in the Latin American context in particular, right? Sometimes there are really high rates of crime and violence also that kind of create the preconditions for people accepting a certain level of violence in securitization or in the name of securitization, right? And so I wondered if you could talk about how sort of the absence of felt security or of kind of a sense of community safety fuels that popularity of punishment. And you've written elsewhere about the concept of stratified citizenship. I don't know if you want to get into that paper or not, but I think that question of how this kind of political and policy change preys on that existing insecurity is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that at the core, I saw that somebody also asked about Bukele, which I think is one of the quintessential questions, where it's sort of like, well, this guy was reelected with, I don't know what it was, like 80% support, something extremely high, even though he has by all accounts established a dictatorship reestablished dictatorship in El Salvador, while also lowering levels of violence to historic levels, and like by far some of the lowest levels in this hemisphere. And so I think the starting point has to be that we have to acknowledge that everyone has a right to security, everyone has a right to feel safe. But what we often see is that rather than being treated as a universal right, security, safety, policing are more often treated as as a scarce good that can be distributed selectively, often for the benefit of those in power. And so what we see is that often those that have the least social and political power, right, this idea of stratified citizenship, right, those that have the least political and social power also get less security and less safety. But more than just not getting safety, what happens in our unequal societies is that there are clear incentives to frame security problems as being caused by some disfavored outgroup, and present them as security threats, and that the only way to solve that security problem is through the use of repression against that security threat, right, against that marginalized group. And so these marginalized communities are not only given less protection, they're also subjected to repression disproportionately. And I don't think we have to look very far to find these examples. But what we see a lot less commonly in response to real crime and violence concerns that people have, in a context like El Salvador and many U.S. cities, et cetera, is a more comprehensive approach that can actually try to fulfill the promise of security for everyone. A more equitable approach to security that everyone can have access to the safety that in theory is everyone's right. So in the absence of meaningful and equitable solutions, right, to crime and violence, citizens are more often than not presented with a single solution, and that is that more punitiveness on one end of the spectrum, or outright extra legal violence at the other end of the spectrum. That these are the only solutions that they are offered. And so citizens that are affected by these extreme, profound forms of violence that shape their ability to even go outside, and they say, well, if this is the only option that I'm being offered, then I'll take it. An ordinary Salvadoran citizen who says, well, if I don't have to worry about getting extorted every day, I don't have to worry about being robbed, being killed, being sexually assaulted, et cetera, when I go out into the street, my son being recruited into a gang, et cetera, and the only solution is this dictatorship, then I'll take the dictatorship. And so I think we have to really grapple with that. What you stated, Katie, is that these real threats and violence that people face can lead to this popularity of punishment through these channels. And I think the policy solutions are very rarely the policy solutions to this that are more comprehensive, more equitable, are rarely presented. I mean, I challenge any of us to think about what was the Democrats' approach to crime and security and whatnot in the last presidential election. So it's just either not that salient, not something that more people are exposed to, or more often than not, just completely non-existent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to pivot to taking some audience questions, and hopefully our tech will work. So the first person who asked a couple of questions has bowed out, saying that they have to leave early. So then we're going to go to Jolyn Chia, who I believe is still on. I'm going to unmute you and allow to talk. So you should be able to unmute if you'd like to ask your own question, Jolyn.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So sorry, I'm quite new to this space, and I was just wondering, what would the key distinction between repressive and oppressive violence be? I know it was mentioned earlier on, I just didn't manage to catch it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Jolyn. So this is not my theory, my framework, but from my reading of that scholarship, which you can go back to the video and find that slide with citing those studies that have talked about this. My understanding of that literature is that repressive violence is what we typically tend to think about happening in dictatorships, right? Where somebody is participating in a protest, or they are organizing politically in different ways, or they're exercising political rights, and more generally, and they are subjected to different types of violence and coercion. So they may be imprisoned indefinitely, or they may be killed, or they may be even disappeared, right? So perhaps the quintessential example, right, the Argentine dictatorship with the sort of symbolic the number that is so well known worldwide, right, the 30,000 disappeared. That is the kind of quintessential cases of what we think about as repressive violence. People being subjected to violence by the state because of their exercise of political rights. Oppressive violence, again, by my understanding of this literature, is what we tend to see more in these democracies, the US, Brazil, where we see this disproportionate use of force. It can be killings, it can be torture, it could be indefinite, arbitrary imprisonment or other things against typically marginalized groups, but it is not it is not driven by their exercise of political rights. And so that literature, those scholars would say this is not political violence because it is not driven, it is not a result of people's political activity and political rights, but we argue, our argument is that it is political violence because there are clear political motivations and incentives to drive this kind of violence. So that's the distinction between repressive and oppressive violence.
That's very
Thanks.
helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez.
Of course.
Thank you so much. Okay. We've got many more questions coming in and also a raised hand. I think the raised hand is next. So Sarah, I'm gonna unmute you, allow you to talk, and you can ask your question. You should be able to unmute now. That works. Okay, it doesn't seem to be working. If you're able to unmute, you're welcome to ask your question, but we're going to skip ahead in the queue, but you're welcome to type it in the chat or put it in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to connect. So our next question then is from Brooke Jones. Brooke, I'm going to do the same thing, allow you to unmute, and you're welcome to ask your question directly.
Oh, hi, thanks. Okay, so my question is, what were the other measures of police reform, like aside from body cameras, that you looked at that you said had null effects? And why do you think those effects were null, but the body cameras were not?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We ask ourselves the same thing. I mean, I think the some of the other ones were more I would say sort of more comprehensive, some substantive reforms. So strengthening penalties for police officers who kill, more funding for investigations, sort of things of that sort. I think that the reason we find null effects, I mean, remember, this is a one-time moment where people are exposed to differing messages. So people are reading something. I mean, we were, at least through different checks that we did, we were able to confirm that people really were reading the articles. They really did gauge the difference in like the statements that they were hearing from these politicians, or rather they were able to gauge the content of the message that the politicians were making. But this is a one-time short-term exposure that people had, that they just sort of read something. So in some ways it's not surprising that it's going to change more of an immediate attitude. Like, what did I think about this case that I just read about? Or what do I think about this politician that just made the statement, versus more concrete policies, some of which they may have never heard of before. Body cameras, most likely, the vast majority of people have probably heard of before. So I think that that's probably why that particular policy showed the most sort of significant results, because it's probably one that people were familiar with, whereas the other ones they probably had less familiarity with. And again, this really short-term, one-time intervention. One really interesting thing that we want to think about is, what if it was a video? What if it was a longer-term exposure, that people were iteratively exposed to these types of messages? What would be the effects of those? And in some respects, we have a sense of that, because we so often hear, in Brazil, especially in Brazil, we so often hear, and you know, these days in the US, these repressive messages, and less often hear the critical messages from leading politicians. And so in some ways that can help us understand why these reforms are not actually as common as they otherwise should be. Thank you for that. That's a great question.
Thank you. Okay, next up, we've got Nilesh Rathi. I've just allowed you to talk, and so you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. And thank you for the seminar, Dr. Gonzalez. So my question was there any pattern in the amount by which a politician either defending or criticizing police violence affected the responses from the various partisan groups? So as in, like, the degree to which a partisan group's response changed, was it greater or lesser for a particular group? And if there was a difference, do you think it was caused by differing degrees of caring about police violence issues, by differing degrees of faith in the opinions of politicians, or by something else?
That's another great question. I mean, I think overall, if you go back to some of the figures, in some of the cases, the largest, so if you think about the competence one, where there was a kind of a modest increase in with the level of competence that the leftist voters saw of a right-wing politician that criticized police killings, there was a larger reduction the magnitude of the effect was larger for right-wing voters, and the loss of confidence, loss of perceived confidence among those right-wing voters. So generally, we saw larger effects among right-wing voters in that sort of loss of confidence measure. There was another measure, I think it was the case-specific support. We also saw larger effects of when a right-wing politician criticized police violence. We saw a larger effect among right-wing voters. I think your intuition may be right. I mean, part of it, I think, is also those voters definitely have more room to move because they support this at much higher rates. But I think it's a good suggestion, sort of your intuition, that there may be sort of heterogeneity, right? In people's baseline support for police violence or their trust in police or other measures that can affect the extent their susceptibility to being affected by these types of messages. So I think we can definitely go back and do those types of heterogeneous effects and analysis of those heterogeneous effects to understand those differences. Thank you so much for that.
Next question is going to be from, you're very welcome, Adrian Rocha. I'm going to allow you to talk, and then you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Good afternoon, Dr. Gonzalez. Super appreciate the presentation. Very wonderful. I was wondering about when the commentary shifts to the echo chamber created by the initial incitement of violence. So going back to the sort of graph that you had about the effect it had on the competency of the specific members involved, what happens when the dialogue evolves to a reaction to an individual's comment? So I'm thinking about a congressional member's reaction to a mayor's comment, and how does that sort of echo out in the effects? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because often when you have scandals, right, police killing scandals, or just maybe they don't become scandals, but they receive a lot of news coverage, you often do see this back and forth. And so rather than this one-time intervention, this sort of one-time short-term intervention that we've subjected people to, it's this discourse, right, where you sort of see opposing sides chiming in, or potentially an escalating effect of where more prominent figures are getting involved and commenting on these things. And so we expect that that the effects are likely to be amplified when people are seeing sort of more and more prominent politicians making statements in agreement with that of the mayor. We're probably going to see an amplification of those effects. But one thing that was not in this paper, but in the previous paper that I mentioned, that will hopefully be coming out soon, and it was accepted, but it's being evaluated for replicability. So hopefully that will be coming out soon in American Journal of Political Science. But in that paper, we find that subjecting people to competing views about police killings also has some interesting effects. So that in that paper, we presented people to the views of police, sort of what police were saying about victims and what victims' mothers and other actors were saying about victims. And we do find that those counter narratives do reduce and counteract the effects of the police narratives, right? So the police narratives increase support for police killings, just as the politicians' defensive remarks increase support for police killing. But when they are confronted with counter narratives, those reduce that support for police killing. So my guess is that it would have a lot to do with what is the nature of that discourse and that commentary, that back and forth. Is it just an amplification of that previous messaging, or is it are there counter narratives that emerge, particularly from powerful prominent elites? And we expect that it can have a counteracting effect on that support. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Okay, next up we've got, hopefully I will say your name right, Jie Leon. I'm allowing you to talk and asking you to unmute so you can ask your question from the chat this time rather than the Q&A.
Hi, Dr. Gonzalez. Thank you so much. This is Jason from ASH. I love your research, by the way. I have a quick question. It's very related to my own research on police violence. So how do you parsing out the over-policing, the violence caused by the over-policing and the violence actually target on the political opponents. Like that's the repressive / oppressive violences, right? That's something I always find is tricky when we take police violence as the empirical target. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to see if I understand your question, that there's a difference between what is typically maybe thought about oppressive violence, what we think about as over policing in marginalized communities, versus repressive.
Yeah.
Repressive.
I'm more thinking about, like, for example, if a protest have a violent flank, and sometimes the violence could be triggered by the throwing rocks and like the protest initiates violence, or even just crimes, right? That's over policing if like the violence observed in that area. But on in other scenarios, like when there's a peaceful march and the police just starting to hosting peoples or just starting to beating peoples, that's like very blunt, repressive, oppressive violences. I just wonder, how do you parse this out? Because they potentially could have very different political implications. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think there's really good research out there about the perceptions of protests and protest groups, depending on whether the groups engage in violence, or whether the police engage in violence against otherwise nonviolent protests. And so that's not my area of research specifically, so I don't want to go too deep into that. But I will say that in some of the cases that I study, when there is sort of clear evidence of police overstepping, just engaging in clear-cut repression of protest, even when protesters themselves may be engaging in vandalism, or other illegal activity, it can have huge repercussions politically for police institutions. So the case that I'm thinking about is Colombia, where in 2021 they had months of protests, some of which people engaging in vandalism and certainly had a violent flank, certainly had different just a huge array of people that were on the streets. It was just massive protests, and so you had all kinds of people that were protesting, but the police engaged in such outsized repression, resulting in dozens of killings of protesters, some by the police themselves and some by third parties that were kind of potentially working in concert, or otherwise felt liberated to free to engage in violence against protesters. Those episodes led to the huge reduction in credibility, a huge loss of credibility for the Colombian police. And so this idea that it all has to do with what the protesters are doing, at least in the Colombian case, the police's outsized, just very, very heavy-handed, very lethal response to these protests just led to a complete loss of credibility, and they had to undergo a lot of introspection and reform and the like. So I think that there are ways where the police violence is so stark and so outright that it outweighs any sense of, well, people were engaging in violence or people were engaging in vandalism or whatnot. That it can become a huge scandal, irrespective of sort of what protesters are doing.
Thank you for that question and for that answer. Just so folks know, we are past 5:30, but that's because this event is scheduled to go until 5:45. So we appreciate you hanging on, and we do have time for a few more questions, which is good because we have them. So next up is Sharon Frey-Witzer, who asked a question in the chat. Sharon, I am going to allow you to talk and ask you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Thank you. Hello, Professor González. Thanks for a very wonderful presentation. And if nothing else, you seem to have shown clearly that what our politicians say matter. And that seems like an important message to come out of your work. You introduced the Q&A briefly, or perhaps in dialogue with Katie, you mentioned that you sense that background conditions of equality breaking down seems to form the backdrop for the popularity of police violence. And I wonder if you can draw any connections between either this paper or the last one you did, or perhaps work you might do in the future, between that what I think is an astute observation, and work that can be done to empirically support it.
So you're sort of asking about what can we do about this relationship between inequality and support for police violence?
Yeah, I guess
More concretely,
because you come from a bird's eye view of this, you've done your 10,000 hours and you can do that blink. You probably know from whence that kind of information comes and also whence it may become in future studies.
yeah. I mean, I think that other paper, I was like, maybe I should have presented a blend of the two, since I keep referencing it. But I think this other paper, which is called Contesting Repression in Divided Democracies, it centers on the narratives of marginalized groups that are subjected to police violence, and whether or not they are able to change people's attitudes toward police violence. So even in Brazil, which is, in many ways, it's just a worst case scenario in terms of police killings. It's just extremely high in number. It is an extremely unequal society along racial lines, along class lines, and geographic lines, and many others. And police violence enjoys very high support, and politicians openly campaign on it, et cetera, et cetera. Even in this very difficult context, very unequal context, we find that hearing from victims' mothers, so the populations that are racialized, the populations that come from these majority low-income communities, favelas, peripheries, et cetera, that their voices matter and can shape and counteract police narratives that defend police killings, that they significantly reduce support for police violence. And so I think that may be one silver lining or antidote potentially to these other processes that feed the cycle of sort of unequal, inequality, socioeconomic inequality, political inequality, then resulting in this unequal repression as well. And so, comparing this to other work that I've done, where even participatory spaces where community members can come and talk to the police about their concerns also result in these repressive demands being made. And so one policy implication that we take away from that paper and its findings is, well, what are the ways that we can amplify and heighten the voices of victims and victims' families, so that people get different kinds of narratives? Because I think a lot of this really comes down to what information are people, and then probably a lot of our politics, right, really comes down to what information are people reading, are people seeing, are they being exposed to, and that can help mitigate some of this, of these unequal patterns that we're seeing.
Great work, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Next up, hopefully we'll have time for two more, but if not, we will see. The next question is from
I'll try to be
Samuel
brief.
Sokolowski-Tift. I'm allowing you to talk and asking you to unmute to ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you, in your own work or in the work of other people, distinguish between different types of moral justification for police violence. So I guess on the one hand, you might have people who think it might be justified because a police officer was under threat for their lives in a particular way, right? On the other hand, you might have justification just because of how bad the victim is presented as being, or how criminal the victim is presented as being. So that's the main dimension to my question. I guess in general, I'm just really interested in how you might distinguish between different types or levels of police violence. And so it was kind of touched on before, but like lower level, quote unquote, types of violence of like someone getting over policed in a more minor way, or I don't know, like getting mildly hit, not that that's low level violence per se, versus like a killing or something more intense like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a very good question. I think we don't, I don't individually, nor in this survey do we look at sort of people's justification of violence. But one thing that I touched upon in the presentation, but I can sort of expand upon it a little bit more, is that people really respond to the type of information. First, that people have attitudes about police violence that go beyond the details of specific cases. People have very clear views on whether police violence should be higher, lower, or just maintaining it. People have very clear views. Again, this common phrase in Brazil, a good criminal is a dead criminal. People have really clear views on that go beyond what are the specifics of any particular case. But that said, I do think that our one thing that I briefly talked about was when we presented people with the details of a particular case. It was a hypothetical, but it's one that I've seen described throughout my field work of police looking up the criminal record of someone that was in their sights immediately, like on the spot. They sort of stop someone and they say, okay, I'm going to look up your criminal record, and that if that person was found to have a criminal record, that person would be essentially executed because they have a criminal record, not because of anything in that particular interaction. When people were presented with that scenario, that hypothetical scenario, that was where we saw the lowest support, if you recall. That was where we saw the lowest support for police violence, and that was where we saw the lowest partisan difference in support for police violence. So I think that your intuition about, I think that can signal something about people may view different justifications, may consider different justifications of police killings depending on the circumstances and also the information they are provided about it. So I'll stop there so that we have time for the last question. Thank you so much, Samuel, for your question.
Thank you both. Yeah, and I'm gonna allow Suli to definitely ask the last question, but also mention, and it's a good transition, that we're going to continue exploring these themes throughout the rest of the semester. And I think this question is actually a perfect tie-in to next week's discussion, or excuse me, 2 weeks. We're on a hiatus next week. We're back October 8th. So Suli, would you like to unmute and ask your question? And then know that we'll think about it again for the rest of the semester. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So I know you drew the parallel between what's happening in the US and Brazil at the moment, but I think in the US it's happening more in a targeted manner against immigrants. Do you have any insights or data into if there's any difference between how people react to police violence when the target is citizens versus immigrants?
I have not studied that. I mean, I think it depends on sort of how are these outgroups constructed. And so it depends on sort of how are people talked about. In the United States, it's also for the most part, it's not the kind of ordinary local police that are typically involved in police killings. It's not those police that are also engaged in immigration enforcement. Right now, it's by and large these sort of federal officials, mostly ICE, but also other federal law enforcement agencies. And the types of violence are, I mean, some of it is, arbitrary detentions, are things that happen across the board. But the types of actions that people are being subjected to is also different. And so I think the distinction is less, I think that it depends on what are the dimensions on which people are subjected to this kind of construction as a security threat, and what is the security threat that people are posing. And so, of course, you might think, well, people are unlawfully in the country, or they're immigrants, or whatnot. But we see a lot of fusing of different populations that are being subjected to the same to this repressive apparatus, right? So the militarization of LA, the militarization of DC, these are things that are fusing immigrant populations, protesters, and folks who just live in their cities in potentially in high crime areas that are being subjected to the sort of deep saturation over policing that we've seen. And so even though there's different populations that are being targeted by different law enforcement groups, we still see this fusing of a lot of that. And if you see the discourses of the president and others, they fuse them pretty seamlessly. The crime, the protests, the immigrants, and so those distinctions may not be so helpful when it comes to just this construction of security threats that may one day be immigrants, one day be the protesters, one day be folks living in urban neighborhoods. So I agree that it's important to sort of look about how the repression might differ, but also that process of constructing security threats can very seamlessly unify all those populations and subject them to repression pretty seamlessly.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone who participated with questions and in the chat. Thank you to Yanilda for a wonderful presentation and for previewing that work with us. Once those papers are published, we'll happily send them out to our list also so people can stay following on the research. And just to be clear that these topics are going to be consistent throughout the semester. So we had a couple late coming chats about, how do we construe the word criminal? What does that even mean? We're going to talk about it. So please keep coming back. October 8th is our next event, which is focused on policing borders and the designation of enemies within, a really logical tie-in from where we kind of ended on this conversation, and thinking about the mutability of those terms. And also I'm seeing comments in the chat about feedback about the change in format from the open meeting to the webinar. Give us your feedback. We want to hear it and we'll see how we can accommodate it. We're trying to balance various interests here. So thank you all. Thank you, Yanilda. And we are back October 8th. We really appreciate everyone's participation and attendance.
Thank you so much. What an honor to kick off this series of just again, what an incredible group of scholars. And I'll be taking notes next time in the audience.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.